Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and let's talk some politics. So, the news outlet Politico has admitted that upwards of 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. And as we're seeing the battlefield unfolding in Bakhmut and in Ukraine in general, but in particularly Bakhmut, because that's where the heaviest battles are going on, we see that the situation for the Ukrainian army is rapidly deteriorating, and to a certain extent, you can deny things, but then there is a limit, and slowly but surely, Western media is admitting that the situation for Ukraine is not going particularly very well. So I have two articles, one from Azerbaijan 24. It says here, U.S. estimates upwards of 100,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed, according to Politico. But we can read the article itself. Ukraine doesn't have any time to waste. U.S. races to prepare Kiev for spring offensive. In the midst of all of this craziness, the sponsors of the Kiev regime is telling them to conduct a spring offensive against the Russians, which is absolutely insane. But we can read a little bit from it. The U.S. military is rushing equipment to the battlefield and training Ukrainian forces at a rapid pace ahead of a major offensive against Russia expected by late spring. First of all, the rapid pace. You're cutting through corners, trying to hasten the training of these Ukrainian forces to handle Western equipment, which is not going to go very well. I am pretty much convinced that a lot of this Western equipment, especially the F-16 fighters and F-35s and all these things, are going to be handled by NATO personnel. And even if they are going to be handled by NATO personnel, these planes and tanks and whatever, they're going to get destroyed. They're going to get either shot down by the S-500, 400, whatever type of air defense systems that the Russians have. But even so, the scale and brutality of the war is pretty insane, right? The human meat grinder, which the Bakhmut battlefield is referred to. And the United States government has actually admitted that the Russians are not even using majority or a lot of their military capabilities in this battlefield. In fact, for example, the Russian Air Force hasn't really been that active in this war. And then you have all these 300,000 mobilized troops, right? Many of them have still not finished their training. So it looks pretty bad for Russia, but obviously, for Ukraine. But obviously, these troops are not going to stand idly by. They will be put to the battlefield sooner or later. And it says here, ahead of a major offensive against Russia expected by late spring. It's not gonna. I don't think it's gonna happen. I mean, they're gonna try it, obviously. But even Zelensky has admitted that if I don't get this equipment, and the equipment that he's getting now is not enough, by the way, it's gonna be over by the summer. And a lot of military analysts such as Scott Ritter, for example, he believes, for example, that the conflict will be over by the end of the summer. It could be. I'm not a military person, so I take his word for it. Obviously, he can be wrong, but a lot of times his analysis have been proven right, actually. So let's keep on going. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin projected a sense of urgency on Wednesday after a virtual meeting of the multinational Ukraine Defense Contact Group, saying that Ukraine doesn't have any time to waste. You're right. Ukraine should just make peace. And we're going to move on talking about the Chinese peace plan a little bit later. We have to deliver swiftly and fully on our promised commitments, Austin said. That includes delivering our armored capabilities to the battlefield and ensuring that Ukrainian soldiers get the training, spare parts, and maintenance support that they need to use these new systems as soon as possible. As spring approaches, U.S. officials are increasingly concerned about Ukraine's dwindling supply of ammunition, air defenses, and experienced soldiers. Yes, speaking of experienced soldiers, a lot of the soldiers that are in Bakhmut right now they're just conscripts, and a lot of them have been snatched off the streets. Many of them are older men. Many of them are teenage boys. There's even reports of teenage girls being pulled into the battlefield in Bakhmut. So, Moscow and Kiev are continuing to throw bodies into the fight for a southeastern city that the US does not consider strategically important. It is important. It's the linchpin of the Donbass line, basically, for the Ukrainians. This is where they supply their troops via these highways that goes to Bakhmut, and yeah. So it is a very important city. In fact, the Bakhmut is pretty much surrounded. The Russians have put anti-tank weapons on some of these roads, and they are shooting a lot of armed vehicles that the Ukrainians are sending into to the city. And obviously they're also using their artillery. The artillery is the bread and butter of the Russian army. And a lot of NATO people, politicians, didn't really expect that Russia would be able to withstand, for example, the sanctions that were put on them, but as well as the constant, bombardment of ammunition that they often talk about Russia running out of artillery, running out of missiles and drones, etc., etc. But they have been proven wrong time and time again. The reason for that was spoken about it before. Russia's economy is a war economy. They have had 8 years to prepare for this type of situation, and they have also learned from the war with Georgia, albeit that Russia did win that war in 5 days. But one thing that they learned is that the Georgians were extremely effective in small units, which the Russians were not, if I understood it correctly, from Scott Ritter's commentary. And they've learned from that. So they had a lot of time to practice or train to defeat this hostile alliance that we know as NATO, basically, or to wage a war against it, so to speak. But let's proceed. Yes, and we also talked about, before we proceed, the weapons industry, the MIC, the military industrial complex in Russia, is state-owned for the most part, or in many cases also partially state-owned. And due to this reason, it is not profit-driven or as profit-driven, perhaps, as the privatized military industry in the West. They produce military hardware and equipment after need, whilst the Raytheon and these other huge MICs in the West, they do it out of profit. So that is the difference. The Ukrainians have burned through a lot of their ammunition stockpiles. Not completely, but a lot of it. But let's proceed. But the Pentagon says that regardless of Kiev's battlefield strategy, the U.S. wants Ukraine's soldiers to have weapons they need to keep fighting. Russia has spent months pummeling the country with missiles, seeking not only to cause destruction, but also deplete Ukraine's air defense stocks. Ukrainian soldiers have described acute shortages of basic ammunition, including mortar rounds and artillery shells, and upwards of 100,000 Ukrainian forces have been killed or wounded in the year-long war. U.S. officials estimate including the most experienced soldiers. Yes, a in the beginning of the, well, not the beginning, because the war, the assault on Bakhmut has been going on since I think May last year, right? But I remember when the defense lines of the Russians got beefed up in Bakhmut, the most elite units of the Ukrainian army, such as the Svoboda unit, the 93rd Brigades, etc., right? I don't know all these names, right? But there were many of them in there. Their commander of the Svoboda unit, for example, got his legs blown off. So there were reports from Russian soldiers that, you know, the Russian, sorry, Ukrainian soldiers, that the Russian artillery is just overwhelming. They've done an interview with a Ukrainian soldier. He said that the average lifespan in Bakhmut is 4 hours. It says a lot. It's ferocious. And it's very unfortunate that the Zelensky regime is just doing this to its young and its population, all in all, right? Okay, Russia has spent months pummeling the country with missiles. There we go, sorry about that. Ukrainian soldiers have described acute shortages of basic ammunition, including mortar rounds and artillery shells. And upwards of 100,000 Ukrainian forces have been killed or wounded in the year-long war. Sorry, we read that one. Many of these losses are taking place in Bakhmut, where both sides are suffering massive casualties. Obviously, the Russians have suffered casualties. I'm not denying that. I think upwards to, all in all, since the war begun, some say around 40,000, between, yeah, something like that. Maybe, for now, 40,000 soldiers have been killed. But the Ukrainians have 8 times or 10 times higher casualty rates. So you can't, it's not it's not equal, so to speak, in that sense. Led by soldiers from the mercenary Wagner group, Russia has laid siege to the southeastern city for 9 months. Sorry about that. Reducing it to ruins. Ukrainian forces have refused to yield, with President Volodymyr Zelensky insisting that defending Bakhmut is key to holding other eastern cities. Well, Zelensky is admitting it. It's a very important city. Because if Bakhmut collapses, the Donbass line will collapse. The Russians clearly are wanting to press forward to the boundaries of Donetsk all the way to the west, and to do that they need to get hold of Bakhmut and the road network that goes past it, said Dara Masikot, senior policy researcher at the RAND Institute. But Austin recently told reporters that Bakhmut is more of a symbolic value than it's a strategic and operational value. Instead, U.S. officials are more focused on getting Ukraine ready for a major spring offensive to retake territory, which they expect to begin by May. The West and the Ukrainian government is extremely obsessed with retaking, for example, Crimea. And we've spoken about Crimea before. Upwards to 93% of the population voted overwhelmingly, whether they be Russian, Ukrainian, or Tatar, to be a part of the Russian Federation. So how are they going to maintain this area? But anyway, hundreds of Western tanks and armored vehicles, including for the first time 8 armored vehicles that can launch bridges, and allow troops to cross river, are en route to Ukraine for the offensive. The US and the European partners are also flowing massive amounts of ammunition and 155mm shells, which Ukraine has identified as its most urgent need. US aid packages going back 4 or 5 months have been geared toward what Ukraine needs for this counteroffensive, said one US official, who was granted anonymity due to administration's ground rules. They always have an anonymous official. While U.S. officials are careful not to appear to tell Kiev how to fight the war, Pentagon leaders said Wednesday that the equipment and training being provided will enable Ukraine to win the war where and when it chooses to do so. There is a significant ongoing effort to build up the Ukrainian military in terms of equipment, munitions, and training in a variety of countries in order to enable Ukraine to defend itself, said Joint Chiefs Chair General Mark Milley. The increased Ukrainian capability will allow the Ukrainian leadership to develop and execute a variety of options in the future to achieve their objectives and bring this war to a successful conclusion, Milley said. More than 600 Ukrainians in February completed a 5-week training program in Germany that included basic skills such as marksmanship, along with medical training and instruction on combined arms maneuver with US-made Bradley fighting vehicles and Stryker armored personnel carriers. Those forces are now back on the battlefield, and a second batch of hundreds of additional soldiers are now going through the program. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials have been pressing Kiev to conserve artillery shells and fire in a more targeted fashion. This is a particular concern in Bakhmut, where both sides are expending ammunition at a rapid pace. Some in the Pentagon think they are burning up ammunition too fast, said retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, former commander of U.S. Armed Forces in Europe. Excuse me, they are in a massive fight for the survival of their country against an enemy that has huge advantages in artillery ammunition and is not letting up. So even the Americans are admitting that the Russians have an advantage when it comes to ammunition. Kiev has not yet settled on a strategy, U.S. officials said, but it has essentially two options: push south through Kherson into Crimea, or move east from its northern position and then south, cutting off the Russian land bridge. The first option is not realistic, officials said, as Russia has dug in its defenses on the east side of the Dnieper River. And Ukraine does not have the manpower for a successful amphibious operation against that kind of force. The second is more likely, officials say. In addition to sending weapons and providing training, senior American generals hosted Ukrainian military officials in Wiesbaden, Germany this month for a set of tabletop exercises to help Kiev wargame the next phase of the war. President Joe Biden last month ruled out sending F-16 fighter jets, and senior U.S. officials have repeatedly said that the aircrafts are not in the cards right now. But officials are working on other ways to boost the Ukrainian Air Force, including attempting to mount advanced medium-range air-to-air missile on its Soviet-era MiG-29s, and assessing the skills of Ukrainian pilots. It's going to be harder and harder for Ukraine, though, to use their MiG-29s. And even if they do get, like I said, these American planes, hypothetically, I think they're going to be handled by NATO personnel. But what I'm trying to say is that the Russians have pretty much destroyed a lot of the airfields in Ukraine. So are you going to launch them from Poland? This means that Poland is now a legitimate target for Russian hypersonic missiles or other types of weapons to bomb Poland. And this can trigger a World War III response, and to conclude it can be a nuclear war. We can face a nuclear holocaust. And what really bothers me is the fact that very few people around me, at least in Swedish society, American society as well, a lot of people don't really care like that. I mean, they're just oblivious to this shit, which is crazy. But anyway, 2 Ukrainian pilots recently wrapped up an assessment at an Air National Guard base in Tucson, Arizona, for U.S. military instructors to assess what training they need to better employ the aircrafts and capabilities the West has already provided, including bombs, missiles, and guidance kits. The program included simulator flights, but the pilots did not fly in American aircrafts, officials say. An effort to mount AMRAAMS on the MiGs, if it proves successful, could also significantly increase the capability of Ukraine's fighter pilots to take out Russian missiles, officials said. As quickly as Ukraine is running out of ammunition, Russia's human and equipment losses are even more acute, forcing Moscow to appeal to rogue nations such as Iran for additional weapons. Oh, we have already, popped a hole in that nonsense, because the equipment losses for Russia is not acute. They are spitting out military equipment from their factories like nothing. Like, it's crazy, right? They are working 24/7. Like I've said, they have adopted their economy for a war economy. Russia remains isolated. Their military stocks are rapidly depleting. The soldiers are demoralized, untrained, and unmotivated conscripts and convicts, and their leadership is failing them, Millie said. Now, this is a bunch of projection and nonsense. First of all, the Wagner Group is not using convicts as conscripts anymore. I mean, Prigozhin has went out with it. And the reason for that is because the reports have circulated, and there's videos on Telegraph where Russian soldiers have complained that these convicts or ex-convicts, well, they are convicts still, they're under contract, but they have a hard time following orders. They're basically very rebellious to authority. And sure, convicts can be good soldiers in the sense that they are crazy motherfuckers who wants to kill people, right? But that can also obviously be a bad thing too. They're not gonna take orders. They might do some dumb shit, killing civilians. They can, do all types of unnecessary things that can actually harm your military in the long run, right? So that's why they stopped recruiting convicts, as far as I know. Let's continue. Publicly, senior officials say it's up to Zelensky when and where to launch a new offensive, whether to remain in Bakhmut or reposition his forces. President Zelensky is fighting this fight, and he will make the calls on what's important and what's not, Austin said. But he noted that we're generating combat power to a degree that we believe that will provide them opportunities to change the dynamics on the battlefield at some point going forward, whatever point that is. Well, there we go. We can also touch upon the Chinese peace plan. We have it. I'm not going to go through it in detail because it's going to be a very long video. But we can read just like the headlines. But I want to say why the Chinese are so keen to create peace. Well, first of all, China wants to get the reputation of being a peacemaker, a diplomatic power that can settle disputes between nations. That's a very good reputation to have. Its latest achievement was between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which went very successful. It did not involve any Western power, and hopefully, hopefully we will see the results of this peace being implemented in this war-torn area of the world, which is the West Asia, or the Middle East, as it's commonly called. And I think the Chinese want to do the same between the Russians and the Ukrainians. Obviously, the Ukrainians are not going to get back the territory that they lost from the Russians, because the Russians are not going to tolerate another form of Ukrainian military to grow and be used by NATO to agitate against Russia. That's not going to happen. However, China wants peace because the Belt and Road Initiative is going to go via Asia, Central Asia, and into Ukraine. That's why they're also very keen to make sure that peace is going to be settled there sooner or later. And this Belt and Road Initiative is going to go through Ukraine and into Europe. Now, let's see here. Let's just read them like one for one, so you guys can, see how the Chinese resonate about this. So, the first point: respecting the sovereignty of all countries. Universally recognized international law, including the purpose and principles of the United Nations Charter, must be strictly observed. The sovereignty and independence and territorial integrity of all countries must be effectively upheld. All countries, big or small, strong or weak, rich or poor, are equal members of the international community. All parties should jointly uphold the basic norms governing international relations and defend international fairness and justice. Equal and uniform application of international law should be promoted, while double standards must be rejected. Russia's not going to give back those territories. No way. Even if the Chinese are settling a peace plan. But this is the best thing that Ukraine can go for right now. The Ukrainians, if they want to preserve their young ones, their soldiers, and rebuild their economy, because the Chinese will invest there, then go for this peace plan. Abandoning the Cold War mentality. This is I was going to say a sexy idea, but the problem is we have a bloc in the world, if we want to call it that, the transatlantic bloc, the Western bloc, or whatever, who have pretty much had a lot of economic monopoly in the world for the last 500 years. And they're not going to give up this power very easily. So, and as you can see, they act very erratic. And collapsing empires are very erratic. But anyway, the security of a country should not be pursued at the expense of others. The security of a region should not be achieved by strengthening or expanding military blocs. The legitimate security interests and concerns of all countries must be taken seriously and addressed properly. There is no simple solution to complex issues. All parties should following the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative and sustainable security, and bearing in mind the long-term peace and stability of the world, help forge a balanced, effective and sustainable European security architecture. That's a little bit from that. I said we were not going to read them, but yeah. Sometimes you just have to. Number 3 is ceasing hostilities. Conflict and war benefits no one. All parties must stay rational and exercise restraint, avoid fanning the flames and aggravating tensions, and prevent the crisis from deteriorating further or even spiraling out of control. All parties should support Russia and Ukraine in working in the same direction and resuming direct dialogue as quickly as possible, so as to gradually de-escalate the situation and ultimately reach a comprehensive ceasefire. Russia wanted to sign a deal with the Ukrainians, and so did the Ukrainians, but the West ruined that. This was in early April in 2022. The goal of the Russian army, of the Russian government, was not to destroy necessarily, to sort of impose a political government, like a government that they want to handpick in the beginning. They just wanted to compel the Ukrainians to abide by the Minsk agreement. Okay? And they wanted to destroy the Ukrainian army, obviously, but they wanted Zelensky there. That's why it's called a special military operation, because they wanted to destroy the Ukrainian army, but they didn't want to destroy necessarily the Ukrainian government, because they still want those state institutions there so they can have somebody to negotiate with. In fact, the fact that Zelensky is still alive and pretty much speaks about that. This isn't like the US when they entered Iraq or Libya, where they killed government leaders, hanged these Arab leaders and killed them, right? And we could think whatever they want of it. I'm not a big fan of Saddam, for example, but Iraq is a sovereign country, and what they did was wrong. It was based on lies. Weapons of mass destruction didn't exist. Resuming peace talks. That's number 4. Resolving the humanitarian crisis. The Ukrainian refugee problem is going to be a huge problem for the European Union. But I find it funny that a lot of Western media is not talking about Ukrainians who are fleeing to Russia, actually. But anyway, protecting civilians and prisoners of war. Keeping nuclear power plants safe. Yes. And 8, reducing strategic risks. 9, facilitating grain exports. And 10, stopping unilateral sanctions. 11, keeping industrial and supply chains stable. And 12, promoting post-conflict reconstruction. And that's the 12-point plan, peace plan by the Chinese. I think it's a good idea, and I hope the Ukrainians will go for this route rather than continuing sacrificing, their men into this chaos. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and please hit the subscribe button, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of these videos. And I am so grateful for all the subscribers. We're slowly growing here, and I appreciate it very much, actually. So stay blessed, guys, and take care.